Hi, Misha here, and last time we looked at the Swedish AG model 1942, or rather 42B to be exact, as most all of us have. Ljungman in 6.5 by 55. And in that video, I said we would eventually get to the somewhat more common and somewhat more famous version, the Egyptian Hakim, which is chambered for 8 by 57, 7.92 Mauser or IS. It actually was produced in larger numbers, about twice as many. And of course, this is unique action, and in some ways they're very similar guns, in some ways pretty different. So with that, let's talk a bit more about the history and features, things like that. So very brief recap, the AG-42 was designed in Sweden using a tilting or tipping bolt, very much like found in the Russian Tokarev. And it uses a direct impingement gas system. Has a 24.5-inch barrel and weighs in a bit under 10 pounds. It's a pretty beefy gun. And it has a detaching 10-round magazine, although it's intended to be loaded with 5-round chargers, strippers. And about 30,000 were built between 1942 and 1944. But after that, Sweden pretty much hung up the tooling and had no use for it. Now, they did upgrade to the AG-42B, a design that was kind of finalized in 1953, and work was done upgrading their stockpiles by 1956. But aside from that, the tooling really wasn't doing much of anything. And that's where Egypt comes in. Originally, in the late 40s, Egypt contracted with FN Herstal in Belgium for their then very new FN-49 rifle, chambered for 8mm Mauser. And this original order would be done under the king, but he was deposed, overthrown in 1952, and politics ensue. Now, originally they started to receive more and more Soviet aid, both Russian SKSs and actually Czechoslovakian guns like the VZ-52, as well as the submachine guns from there. Now, Egypt would produce a version of the Carl Gustav submachine gun. The M45 is the portrayed. So there's also already kind of a relationship going with Sweden. And what the idea was, they wanted to have their own domestic firearms industry, both for their military and to sell to other Arab nations. Egypt kind of wanted to become the arms dealer for the Middle East, Africa, and essentially the Third World, which was evolving at this time as an alternative. For example, India spearheaded the Third World movement, the unaligned nations, if you will. And so they wanted to be an arms dealer, and Sweden had more or less maintained neutrality throughout World War II and into the Warsaw Pact and NATO era, at least more so than a lot of other nations, so doing business with them was advantageous. And I guess they felt that this rifle, self-loading, durable, relatively straightforward to produce, was a good fit. So in 1955, workers from the Carl Gustav factory worked with actually the factory that would eventually become known as Mahdi, Factory 54, and did some original test runs, yada yada, setting things up, transferring tooling, technology, and sometime in 1956, production was up and running for the Hakim. And they would build these through at least 1965, maybe a hair later. No one knows exactly how many were made, but low end, 65,000, high end, 80,000. Most places say around 70,000. So at least double, give or take, the number of AG-42s made. And of course, they would be in production decades after the AG-42 was not. So with that, let's talk about some of the mechanics and how this is similar and different, and also how it's more like the original AG-42 instead of the AG-42B, even though someone actually in the comments in my last video kind of already gave away that kind of cool aspect. And of course, you can't do a video on the Hakim or the Jungmann without someone making an M1 Grand Thumb joke. And you know I'm fucking with you, right? I had to do it. But later on, I did bring out a sacrificial pencil, so we can have some fun there. The action is very much the same, but this does have the early style top cover with pretty simple pads. On the Swedish version, they replaced these with these knobs. It has a case deflector, but it was originally just steel. This is a little on the smaller side. It's a little bit larger, but they would put a rubber bumper here. This has a more traditional rear sight out to 1,000 meters. With the B, they went to this pretty nifty knob adjustment. Moving forward, pretty famously known, the AG-42 does not have an adjustable gas system, but with the Hakim, they added one here. There is this area here. Now, they didn't want soldiers playing with this, so it requires a tool. And it has 7 gas settings plus an 8th just to fully close it off. Now, why did they need a gas adjustment when the Swedes did not? Well, the Swedish military was using 2 different types of ammunition, very nicely well made. Even 6.5 Swede is very well made ammo. But Egypt, their 8mm, for one thing, they were using surplus ammo from Lord knows where. They obtained all kinds of leftover ammunition from World War II, produced in various places. Plus, they made their own, but quality was kind of iffy. Plus, again, sand, dust, desert. It would be a good idea to be able to adjust it if the ammo was too powerful or too weak. Perfectly makes sense. To do that, they also extended the upper handguard. The barrel length itself is essentially the same, but with the Jungmann, the porting is in the barrel. The muzzle brake is integral. With the Hakim, the muzzle brake is actually attached on the front to the front sight base. Kind of the same concept as the SVT-40. It's not removable unless you want to take off your whole front sight base. The front sight itself is quite similar. Now, the B model uses a Mauser style cleaning rod in the Swedish Mauser bayonet. The Hakim uses the same type of bayonet, but since it's kind of based on the earlier tooling, it would have taken the unique cleaning rod. I guess Egypt just didn't see a point in that, so they just put a screw in the end. Didn't worry about it at all. The same thing goes for the magazine. When they went to the B, they added the secondary mag release in the front, plus the one in the back. But with the Hakim, there's no mag release. Instead, you have this down, it's locked in, flip it up, and then push it forward, and it releases. I've heard some people complain this is difficult to do. It seems easy enough to me. I just did it one-handed and no eyes. But that's a common thing, kind of a way to lock a mag in. That was the early concern. Plus, these are high-end magazines, and they really only made 1 per gun, maybe a handful of spares if they got damaged. But no, the idea, this was to be topped off with Mauser chargers. And it has the safety in the back. I showed the operations and disassembly in the first video, so you can check that out. One kind of interesting thing too, there's no trapdoor in the buttstock, but if you actually remove your butt plate, there's a hollow compartment in here. So I don't know if that was done just to lighten the stock a bit, Or if the idea was you could put an emergency supply of, I don't know, cigarettes or condoms or opium. I don't know. But if you unscrew it, there is a small compartment in there, or at least a hole. And this is a heavier gun. The Jungmann already is heavy at nearly 10 pounds. This thing tips the scales at almost 10.5 pounds. It's also slightly longer. It gets up to about 49 inches, whereas the Jungmann's about 48. So it is not a svelte gun, but it is pretty straightforward technology, requiring old school machining. It does require wood, of course, solid wood stock. Pretty nice triggers on these, and they're actually known for reasonably good accuracy. So with that, where's that pencil at? So just like with the Swedish gun, we press this forward to grab. It is a stronger spring because we're firing 8mm. And we come back. Now this has a hold open on an empty magazine. And it does not go forward. And you're supposed to charge this with clips. And you can lock the bolt rear by putting the safety on. But what if you forget? Let's put some rounds in. This is really going to be difficult to do on camera. Oh, here's another fun fact. There's nothing to grab onto with this bolt. So, theoretically, to grab it again, you want to push forward. Of course, that's in the way. You can hear it crunching more. So to get it out, you actually have to pull it back. And try not to get your other finger. It's just a pencil, but gee. Now that went forward, of course, because the magazine follower was down. So let's do it this way. Clunk. Not quite as bad. At least it didn't split it in two. What's happening is you wouldn't want that. But what's happening, the end of the gas tube and the end of the carrier there where they made up, very sharp edge, and there's nothing to retard the movement forward. At least on some guns, if you have that split second of a crap, you might be able to grab onto something. With a Jungmann type design, there's no doing that. And like I said, the 8mm version actually has a stronger spring than even the 6.5. I've talked in video 1 about the name Jungmann, as well as Eric Eklund, who developed it. Hakim, the name traditionally means judge or authority, although for this gun it's also kind of lore that it was named after a physician in the Egyptian army named Hakim, or rather probably yelled Hakim. Either way, it all gets integrated. You can look up Arabic translations. I flipped this over and realized my pencil's losing its lead. So anyway, these were in production for roughly a decade, and they don't seem to have ever hit major frontline, long-term military use in Egypt. And almost as if it was something they just wanted to get their industry built with, or as often happens, they were tooling up and starting to do these, and then the Soviets came in around 1957-58, started offering aid, kind of the communist version of Uncle Sugar. And so they started either gifting these or giving these to second-line reservist forces. It's once upon a time it was said these were used during the Suez Crisis in October of 1956. These days, it's pretty well known that there's no photographic evidence of this, or if so, maybe only one or two. And anyway, there was only a few thousand at most in the world when that was happening. This really didn't appear in large numbers until the late 50s. But it was used in Yemen by both Egyptian forces there and their allies in Yemen. That they had an ongoing disorder in the 1960s. They were in service during the 6 Days War, 1967, but they were already kind of a second-line reservist gun because Kalashnikovs were already a thing. Egypt was just starting to consider making the Kalashnikov, but they had been using essentially donation guns from the USSR and its allies for almost a decade. Because if you look at what the Israelis captured off the Egyptians in the 6 Days War, it's mostly Kalashnikovs, hence why we ended up kind of with the Galil. They didn't seem to capture that many Hakims. And again, they were still in Egyptian inventory during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, but they were being phased out and really didn't play a critical role. By this point, Egypt was not only using Soviet-made AKs, but they were manufacturing their own AK as the Misr, what we know as the Mahdi. And of course, after that, well, actually a year before technically, the Russians were kicked out of Egypt, and eventually, after that, Egypt would move away from the Comm Block and towards the west. And these would be put into storage or given away to Egyptian allies, for example, Somalia, and they were used against Ethiopia, a few other little hot spots in Africa. But for the most part, they were put into storage and then sold as surplus here in the USA. They started coming in the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and were in really pretty good shape, all things considered. And then, of course, recently, 2020, Royal Tiger, IO, imported another batch out of Ethiopia, probably captured by them. And they were in okay shape. I mean, they came out of Ethiopia, but they did appear. The big difference is, one time, these were $200 to $500 guns, and now they're a $1,000 gun. But, you know, no milsurp is cheap anymore. What are you gonna do? So that is the Hakim. And a broken pencil. And again, if you didn't see my previous AG42 video, I've covered these in multiple times, but it seemed like a good time to go back over them as we get into the end of the year and just talk about fun guns. So what do you think? Do you own a Hakim? If so, what's your serial number? When was it made? Any fun stories about it? They're certainly interesting guns, and they are actually quite well made. So with that, I would ask you to please like, share, subscribe, and if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.